February 25th, 2026. We are in the 5th year, and this is day 2 since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Welcome. I greet you. For today's report, we won't cover the front situation as there aren't many updates yet, especially in the 2 main directions of attack near Bukrovsk and also from the direction of the Ukrainian offensive. There is nothing new compared to the situation report from the day before yesterday. I actually recorded this one here on the 24th of February at night, just before the 25th of February. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to provide you with a situation report yesterday. I'm currently doing military service and I get home from the barracks quite late. And then there was also a fire department call in between. That means I got home sometime just before 11. And of course, I can't start researching for 4 hours and then put a report on your desk. That's why today's report is for the 25th of February. Mainly contains content from the previous day, but let's take a look at the situation anyway. We won't look in detail at what happened at the front. As I said, there was hardly any information about that anyway. That's why we'll just use this opportunity on this special day, the beginning of the 5th year of the full-scale invasion, to take a brief look back. Right now, it's worth taking a sober look at the balance sheet. Russia set out with the goal of breaking Ukraine politically, crushing it militarily, and isolating it strategically. None of these goals have been achieved. The government in Kiev has not been overthrown, and the armed forces have not been defeated. The will of the people to resist has not collapsed, and the city was not captured. Not a single regional capital has fallen permanently into Russian hands. In the spring of 2022, Russia temporarily controlled about 27% of the territory. Today, that share is about 20%. Despite enormous mobilization, massive arms production, and constant offensives, they were not able to regain the difference. However, the personnel losses are enormous. Western estimates speak of about 1.2 million Russian soldiers killed or permanently wounded. Even if you set this number lower, the scale remains historically high. At the same time, Russia has massively restructured its economic base. The energy infrastructure toward the West is effectively decoupled, partly due to sanctions and partly due to physical destruction. The economy is now primarily producing only for the war. While this secures output in the short term, it hardly creates any long-term value. Technology, capital, and markets are lacking, and geopolitically, Russia is now more dependent on China than ever before, almost like a little puppet from the Asian region. Raw materials are being sold at significant discounts, but China is hardly buying anything from Russia anymore. Moscow's negotiating position is absolutely weak and has not become stronger in the Asian region. At least, that doesn't mean that Russia is finished militarily. It doesn't mean that Russia will collapse tomorrow. It doesn't mean that the Russian army will completely surrender in the next few hours. Just as other situation reporters want us to believe, it can keep fighting, it can cause damage, and it will. But the original objective, meaning a quick victory, a strategic reordering of Europe, and so on, has failed. So the crucial question is no longer whether Russia can win, but how long Russia can maintain this state of exhaustion. A lasting peace does not come from freezing the gains of aggression. History shows that unanswered expansion rarely marks the end, but rather the pause before the next conflict. So if this war is to be ended sustainably, it must be through a clear strategic defeat of the aggression, not by rewarding it. But let's stay with it, with the question, victory or defeat? This question has been asked for 4 years now, and most of the time it's even asked incorrectly. Why? I'll explain that now. If you look at the situation objectively, you have to say that a Russian victory by their own means has become increasingly unlikely. But that doesn't automatically mean a Ukrainian victory. Russia entered this war with a maximal goal. Regime change in Kiev, disempowerment of Ukraine, pushing back NATO, none of that was achieved. On the contrary, Kiev still stands. Ukraine exists as a state, and NATO is even bigger than before. And that wouldn't have been possible without Russia, because that's exactly why Finland and Sweden joined. Germany and other countries no longer import Russian gas, and those are hard facts. Militarily, Russia has deployed enormous resources. Over 1 million of its own citizens are now under arms. Arms production is running at full speed, and still 4 years of war. In the Donbass, we're discussing territorial gains of dozens of kilometers, not strategic breakthroughs. No case of a major city with a signal effect, like in 2014 with Crimea, no collapse of the Ukrainian front. None of that is visible. The price is enormously high because we are actually seeing over 1 million losses, as has been announced several times before. Hundreds of thousands of disabled people and hundreds of thousands of men who have left the country. At the same time, the demographics are collapsing. The birth rate is historically low, and the labor market has been swept clean. Anyone who can work is either needed in the arms industry or sent to the front. So the economy is only running in war mode now. The arms and flower sectors are booming. Why the flower sector? Well, just take a look at the cemeteries. They're the only ones in the civilian sector who are really still making money, and a lot of money, from this war. Civilian sectors continue to stagnate, except for the flower sector. Reserves are being depleted, taxes are rising. Even so, China is investing significantly less than hoped and can no longer compensate for this deficit from the West. That's not the picture of a rising world power. That's the picture of a country that has put everything on one card and gained nothing. And yet Putin still wants to continue. Despite all that, even if you say he might not even know about so many things at the front, we know how, especially on the Russian side, things are lied about as they go up the chain. We know that territorial gains and losses are simply embellished or made up. And much of what happens at the front, or what we know, Putin probably doesn't know. But even with the things he knows and what he can recognize domestically, even then, he won't stop, but will keep going. And why? Because stopping for him could mean political resilience in who he is, compared to continuing. A clear military success is not in sight, so they're relying on attrition, on time, on political fractures in the West, on an European Union that starts arguing again, where Orban does whatever he wants, on an American policy that keeps reducing support. That's the simple core. Russia probably can't win this war anymore by defeating Ukraine militarily, but it hopes that Ukraine will simply collapse politically or economically. And that happens before the Russians do. So what we're seeing isn't a path to victory, but rather the path into a very long war of attrition. And that rarely ends with victory parades. It usually ends in a state where all parties involved are weakened, militarily, economically, and above all, socially. And that's exactly the realistic scenario at the moment. According to the Russian front blogger Volt 8, the results of the war are, quote, honestly mediocre. He describes an army that is run by corruption, cronyism, and internal agreements. Decision-making is slow. Leadership is complacent. He is especially critical of the soldiers' treatment. Intimidation of mobilized forces, forced contract extensions, and increasing bureaucratic pressure have severely damaged morale. And he is one of the bloggers who are at the front. He witnesses all of this firsthand. The timing is also striking. It was only in the 4th year of the war that Russia effectively used strategic weapons. We're now in the 5th year, but as I mentioned, the drug component emerged in the 4th year of the war. And it was only in the 4th year of the war that they seriously began to fight corruption in the military-industrial complex. This process has dragged on for a long time, indirectly admitting structural deficiencies. After 4 years of war, they admit basic organizational mistakes remain unresolved. At the same time, the blogger tries not to present the situation as a defeat. He also claimed that there are heavy losses, enormous efforts, and yet they have not lost. In quotation marks, so-called occupied Russian territories have been recaptured. Counterattacks have been repelled, but the price has been enormous. His statement is particularly explosive, saying that the path to a turning point can only be achieved through quick and correct decisions, as well as technological superiority in reconnaissance and long-range combat, basically with drones, artillery, concealed firing positions, and so on. Classic mass infantry assaults are no longer viable after 2024. And the fact that they are only realizing this now is actually quite remarkable. But still, such voices are interesting because they don't come from the opposition, but rather from the pro-Russian camp itself. It's not pacifist criticism. It's really a performance assessment from the perspective of a supporter of this war, who is also on the front lines and moreover on the side of the aggressor. And this assessment is much less triumphant than the official rhetoric suggests. But the subtext is clear. The war is not decided. and the costs are enormous. And even within their own ranks, impatience over inefficient corruption is growing. Strategic sluggishness. We've seen little progress at the front. So what do you do when you can't advance on the battlefield and people are starting to notice? Exactly, you just spread a few lies to justify it. Putin now claims that Ukraine is planning to use some kind of nuclear component against Russia, which he himself can't even describe specifically. Of course, there is no concrete evidence. The British Prime Minister immediately stated that there is no basis for such accusations. Accusations like these, of course, follow a familiar pattern that we all know. Moscow has been using nuclear rhetoric for years, not necessarily as an immediate threat of use, but as a strategic means of pressure. The message is aimed less at Ukraine itself, but of course at the Western capitals and the people living in the West. Escalation is possible, so hold back. That's the message here. Now, when there is talk of alleged sabotage plans against Turk Stream or Blue Stream in the Black Sea, this expands. Russia is constructing an image in which it is not portrayed as the aggressor, but of course as a potential victim, threatened by terror and sabotage or even nuclear components. A striking aspect here is a recurring phenomenon. In the past, Russian accusations about alleged Ukrainian acts of sabotage were often preceded by their own narratives or prepared information campaigns. Naturally, that causes interpretation problems. But whether this is about deterrence rhetoric, domestic mobilization, or actually the preparation of certain measures is rarely possible to clarify clearly in advance. Strategically, the statement serves several purposes. It justifies tougher measures, keeps the level of escalation high rhetorically, and at the same time, tests the reaction of the West. As always, the more strongly Western governments react to such claims or allow themselves to be intimidated, the greater the political dilemma becomes. There are no substantial indications of that. Ukraine is under international supervision and is a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Without concrete evidence, Putin's statements remain a political signal, nothing more and nothing less. And with this sober look at now over 4 years of war, as I said, we're in the 5th year of the war, I want to thank all subscribers, channel members, and the Algo crew, as always. Thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Renneke, Silla, Dietrich, Fred, Jumer, and Hofer. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next report.